someone else to perform acts against the will of the individual.
Shoot Bobby Raymond through the forehead.
Yes, ma'am.
Is control of the human being, such as the Manchurian Candidate, possible?
We are not professing to tell you the complete story of these activities. We are professing to tell you the complete story that we know. But these records that we've uncovered don't tell the story. They tell pieces of it.
This is a story that has been told in bits and pieces over the last few years. This is an attempt to pull most of it together. We know we don't have the full story. We do, however, have some striking new revelations and insights. It is a story of a concerted search by several United States intelligence agencies to perfect mind control. In 1953, at the height of the Cold War, President Eisenhower appointed Allen Dulles to be head of the CIA, the first peacetime intelligence agency in United States history. And as it had during OSS days, the search for mind control continued. As this 1952 CIA document shows, the aim at that time was controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation. But it was a discovery here in Basel, Switzerland, at Sandoz Laboratories by Dr. Albert Hoffman, that led the intelligence agencies of America to believe that they had found the panacea. The discovery was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD.
It was one of the first times that anybody had run into a powerful drug that was different than anything else that they knew anything about.
John Gittinger, recently retired chief psychologist for the CIA. This is the first time Gittinger has been interviewed publicly.
That, in effect, disable the whole city by putting a very small amount in a water supply. Yeah.
It would not be long before the CIA and other intelligence agencies discovered that LSD was not only powerful, but dangerous. A former CIA official who worked on these programs did not wish to be filmed or recorded. The statements he made to ABC consultant John Marks will be read by someone else. They have been corroborated by ABC News. He tells what happened to one co-worker when LSD was put into his coffee in this Washington office building. The LSD took hold and he ran to the street, as illustrated here.
He sort of knew he had it, but he couldn't pull himself together, and it got away from him. He reported afterwards that every automobile that came by was a terrible monster with fantastic eyes, out to get him personally. It was a real horror trip for him. It was hours of agony. It was like a dream that never stops with someone chasing him. It was awfully hard to persuade him that his friends were his friends at that point. He was alone in the world, and everyone was hostile. He had become a full-blown paranoid.
The CIA's interest in LSD was intense. The worry was that the Russians would get hold of it. Were the Soviets into LSD?
I'm going to have to say I'm sure they were, but if you ask me to prove it, I've never seen any direct proof of it.
But at one point, intelligence information received from Switzerland said that Sandoz Laboratories was about to put 100 million doses of LSD on the open market. And it caused enough concern within the agency that the United States was prepared to buy the entire supply. However, a slight mistake had been made.
I just found out on a new CIA document that there were no such large quantities of LSD on the market.
Author John Marks has filed numerous Freedom of Information suits against the CIA and has unearthed much new material in this field. He is the author of the forthcoming book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, a history of OSS and CIA work with mind control. He is also a consultant for this report.
What happened is that there was a military attaché in Switzerland, an American officer, who got milligrams and kilograms mixed up. In other words, he made a mistake of thinking 1/1000th of a gram was the same as 1,000 grams, which is a mistake of 1,000,000 times. So when the CIA got the intelligence that there were 100 million doses on the market, in fact, there were 100 doses.
The man who would oversee the CIA's research into drugs and most of the agency's behavior programs is this man, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview.
I recently received a document from the CIA which described Dr. Gottlieb's role in carrying LSD overseas during the early 1950s to slip to a foreign political leader just before he was supposed to give a speech. The hope was that the man would discredit himself in front of his followers. Dr. Gottlieb continued to personally carry drugs overseas for the CIA, all during the 50s and early 60s.
In their never-ending search for the miracle weapon, CIA operatives would search here in the remote mountain areas of southern Mexico for what up to then had been considered a myth, magic mushrooms. They would use this man, a part-time chemist for the CIA, to dupe this man, a vice president of a bank, and an amateur mycologist or mushroom expert, to try to get to the magic mushrooms and turn them into a drug.
They didn't know about it.
But it would be the amateur, R. Gordon Wasson and his colleagues, who would win the race.
That's no record left.
It would be Wasson who would discover the magic mushrooms were no myth.
We went into the Mazatec area, far from the highways, remote from Mexico City. There we found that rotten bagasse, as it's called, bagasso, covered with mushrooms. These mushrooms I didn't know, had never seen. They were the sacred mushrooms.
Wasson would also discover and record the ancient mystical rites of the mushrooms from a local shaman or magical priestess, Maria Sabina.
There we found her, and we found her daughter, Apollonia. They were delighted with the mushrooms, their freshness. They went into ecstasy. It was a thrilling night. Maria Sabina allocated to each one of us the mushrooms that we were to eat. Maria Sabina was silent, then she broke into humming, and then she began singing. She sang for 4 hours. And we were seeing incredible sights. They would go slowly or they would go fast as I ordained. All your senses are rendered acute. We say that you see visions, you see hallucinations, but that doesn't begin to tell the story. The hallucinations are only part of it. You hear sound, you smell things. The night was thrilling.
This was the first known mushroom trip by outsiders, was it not?
First known trip by outsiders. First known trip. There's nothing in any record.
Word of Wasson's discovery reached the CIA quickly.
Centuries.
Dr. James Moore, a chemist at the University of Delaware and secretly a full-service agent for the CIA, was a specialist in preparing deadly chemicals on short notice for the agency. Moore was instructed to contact Wasson and to pay to accompany him on another trip to Mexico to get the magic mushrooms. For as agency documents show, the CIA felt it's quite possible that a drug derived from the mushrooms could remain an agency secret. What in the world were they looking for with the magic mushrooms?
I think the best answer to that is that they were looking for fundamental information, new information as fast as it became available. They wanted as rapidly as it became available on compounds that would be capable of causing changes in behavior, changes in mental attitude.
But the CIA would be beaten to the punch on developing the magic mushrooms by Sandoz Laboratories. From the mushrooms, they derived psilocybin.
by the time I was in a position to do anything, Dr. Albert Hoffmann in Switzerland had isolated the principle, identified it, and synthesized it. Remarkably an excellent achievement.
Did you ever consider what would have happened if any of these substances were given to, say, unwitting people?
Oh, I don't remember having considered that specifically.
What if you... I trust perhaps you've thought about it.
Well, I haven't worried about it. Your question again, what would I have thought had I known that
any of these substances would
have been given to
unwitting persons?
You mean a hostile agent of another government?
No, I think
that was probably one of the things I had in mind.
I mean testing it out on an American citizen.
I guess I must seem very, very cold-blooded about this, but I don't recall ever having been very much preoccupied with that issue.
A decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA to do testing on unwitting Americans. As one CIA document says, such testing would be operationally realistic, because testing, given with advance warning, was pro forma at best and resulted in a false sense of accomplishment. A former CIA official who worked on these programs describes for the first time how the decision was made.
I think every last one of us felt sorry to attempt this kind of thing. We knew we were crossing the line. Every decent kid knows he shouldn't steal, but he does it sometimes. We knew damn well we didn't want anyone else to know what we were doing.
The decision was made to do testing on unwitting victims. Who would they be? It was decided they should be on the fringes of society because they were most vulnerable.
It was the borderline underworld. Prostitutes, drug addicts, and other small-timers would be powerless to seek any kind of revenge in case they found out.
And as their predecessors did a decade earlier, the CIA would turn to George White for help. White was now a high-ranking narcotics official. And by this time, the stories about George White were legendary.
One day I was over to see George at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
Leo Jones, a friend of White's who installed bugging equipment for him.
And there was George standing in front of a full-length mirror with a Derringer that he always carried as a second gun, which he had loaded with wax slugs, and was sitting there shooting at his reflection in the mirror, having a general ball for himself.
Heavy drinker. He loved to drink. Mike started out with martinis. He used to start out with martinis. By supper time, he changed to straight whiskey. And later on, he graduated to Gibson's. I think he consumed at least half to three-quarters of a gallon of Gibson's a day.
That's a good drinker.
That's a good drinker.
He could hold his liquor very well, very well. The only thing you would ever tell about George if he was drinking, his speech became a slightly slurred when he drank more than a quart.
By the time the waiter came over, he was really soused. So the waiter says, "May I help you, monsieur?" And George White was busy talking with me. Paid no attention to the waiter, so the waiter tapped him on the shoulder and said, "May I help you, monsieur?" George White turned around, whipped his gun out, and stuck it in the guy's face like this in this crowded restaurant. I could have snuck under the table. I was so embarrassed by it.
George White did not mind bending the law, and he knew the street well. He was the ideal choice for what the CIA had in mind.
We were Ivy League, white, middle class. We were naive, totally naive about this, and he felt pretty expert. He knew the whores, the pimps, the people who brought in the drugs.
White set up so-called safe houses for the CIA in New York, here in Greenwich Village, and later in San Francisco, in this hotel, and in an apartment atop Telegraph Hill with a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
We did quite a study of prostitutes and their behavior. How do you take a woman who is willing to use her body to get money out of a guy to get him to talk about things which are much more important, like state secrets? To find a prostitute who's willing to stay is a hell of a shock. It's a boost to his ego. Most of the time, he gets pretty vulnerable. What the hell is he going to talk about? Not the sex. So he starts talking about his business. It's at that time she can lead him gently. But you have to train prostitutes to do that. We learned a lot about human nature in the bedroom. It wasn't what we had just thought of, you know, the missionary position. We started to pick up knowledge that could be used in operations.
There would be victims in all of this, but as the agency knew, they couldn't fight back. Some entries from George White's diaries. Clarice gets horrors. Janet, sky high. A former CIA official describes how he slipped LSD to a B-girl in a San Francisco bar as recreated here.
I took an ordinary book of matches and a plastic vial that contained the dose. You leaned over her drink with a match. At the moment you struck it, you squeezed the pack. That squirted a liquid. And the sound of the match striking hid the sound of the liquid hitting her drink. It did get to her. It did affect her. She talked about being a little bit nervous. She said she didn't know what the matter was with her. It didn't knock her out. If it did later, I didn't know.
Even if it had, there would have been no way of getting her medical help, for it had to be kept secret. During all of these tests, there was rarely, if ever, medical supervision. As one agency memo says, we have no answer to the moral question. Still another agency source says, if we were scared enough of a drug not to try it on ourselves, we sent it to San Francisco for testing. The safe houses were not the only testing grounds. Millions of dollars would be spent on LSD research at universities throughout the country. And word would begin to spread on campus about this so-called mind-blowing drug. And suddenly, there was the counterculture of the 60s.
It was a sort of elitist drug.
Dr. Sidney Cohen, one of the country's foremost authorities on LSD.
Then, of course, the thing broadened enormously when Tim Leary and the Harvard group spoke so glowingly about the drug.
To Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug. The fallout from that was that the young psychologists began taking it themselves, discovering that it was an intelligence-enhancing, consciousness-raising experience.
The counter case that I would make in relationship to that is to remember that the people who were doing the research were people who would be doing the research regardless of who was the sponsor.
But the more people the CIA helped in LSD research, the more people would be turned on.
I know that some of the studies in which the CIA had supported used as subjects people who later became strong proselytizers of LSD. So in that sense, yes, I think it did sustain the perpetuation of the use of the drug. And it's rather ironic, isn't it?
I don't think anybody working in that time in the remotest ever thought that it would blow up into the kind of thing that it did.
History will judge the role of the CIA and other intelligence agencies in unwittingly contributing to the counterculture of the 60s through their intense interest in LSD and other hallucinogenics. But for the moment at least, the argument can be made that the CIA helped usher in the age of Aquarius. Covering a span of history such as we are in this report, one can get sidetracked by the so-called glamour and mystery of espionage work. But what you can't lose sight of is what this would all mean in terms of individual human beings. There would be deaths. There would be long-lasting and harmful effects. The best-known case is that of this man, Frank Olson, a chemist employed by the Army Chemical Corps, who in 1953 was slipped LSD unknowingly at a meeting with CIA officials. Shortly after that, Olson went into severe depression. He ended his life at this New York hotel by diving through a shaded closed window in his 10th floor room. Frank Olson was the first known fatality in the CIA's LSD program. Olson left behind a widow Alice and 3 children, but it would be years before they learned the real story of his death. Shortly after his suicide, Alice Olson was visited by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the man who had administered the drug, and by Robert Lashbrook, his deputy, who was the last person with Frank Olson the night of his death.
It was probably to check me out and see whether I was handling myself and handling the situation, whether I was hysterical. And I'm sure they left the house feeling ever so much better because I had been gracious and hospitable to them, so that I must have played right into their hand and made them feel fine.
23 years later, how did you feel about that meeting?
My anger was unbelievable at how I had been duped for this length of time, and the anguish which was unnecessary.
Anyone who knew during all of those years never told Alice Olson the real story of her husband's death. She would discover it by accident more than 2 decades later. In essence, it was a 22-year-long cover-up. Lyman Kirkpatrick was Inspector General of the CIA at the time of Frank Olson's death. Kirkpatrick attempted to have those responsible reprimanded. He wrote a series of letters for the CIA director's signature. In the first he wrote, those responsible had shown exceedingly bad judgment. It was rejected by high agency officials. And 5 drafts later, it was watered down to bad judgment. And those responsible were told they should not consider the letters to be reprimands. But had not the Olson case occurred within the secret confines of the CIA, would not this case have been a prosecutable case? Perhaps
Certainly, I would think very definitely prosecutable, and certainly from the point of view of Mr. Olson, why it should probably have been actionable.
If you had an opportunity to say something to either Sidney Gottlieb or Bob Lashbrook, what would you want to say?
I really don't know. Except to say that I believe that nobody has the power to intercede in people's lives in the way they did.
Frank Olson's suicide slowed down the CIA's testing of LSD and other drugs, but only momentarily. It would soon pick up again, and the guinea pigs were mental patients and prisoners. Here at the Federal Drug Hospital at Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Harris Isbell would test LSD and other drugs on prisoners. And as a reward, they would be given the drug of their addiction. One of them was Eddie Flowers, then a teenage addict. He is now fully recovered and is the director of this Washington, D.C. Drug Rehabilitation Center. That's really Alice in Wonderland. Here you were in a public health facility for drug rehabilitation. You're being given LSD without your knowledge, and as a reward for it, you're getting heroin.
Well, when I look back on it, I get angry because the biggest piece of me recognizes that I was used. Okay, that a weakness was capitalized on.
The CIA was not the only government agency interested in the possibilities LSD and other drugs presented for mind control. The Army Chemical Corps first started working with the CIA and then branched off on its own. It, too, tested drugs on unwitting victims. and a death would result. The case of this man, Harold Blower, a tennis pro, seen here with his daughter Elizabeth, is well known. In 1953, Blower was a private patient at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He was given 5 injections of a mescaline derivative that was being tested secretly for the Army Chemical Corps. With the 5th injection, Harold Blower died. As with the Olson case, a 22-year cover-up followed, until finally the Army admitted the real details of Blower's death. From a previously classified deposition of Dr. James Cattell, who administered the mescaline derivative, on the purpose of the drug testing, to produce symptoms similar to those that you see in schizophrenia, on how much the patient knew about all this. We didn't delineate all the possibilities of what might happen, because then you contaminate your experiment. Cattell then relates that he never even knew what drug he had given Harold Blower because of the secrecy of the Army experiments. We didn't know whether it was dog piss. This was secret. This was a secret. We weren't in on it. We asked Blower's daughter Elizabeth for her reaction.
What? How can anybody react to that? I mean, that is so far from what you'd expect from a human being, never mind a doctor, never mind a professional specialist who's supposed to care about people's minds. It's unbelievable.
Other documents strongly suggest that the Army tried to defraud the courts when the Blower family sued. This memo from the Judge Advocate General's office suggests putting all documents relating to the case in the Chemical Corps' procurement center. There, they would be beyond the subpoena power of the plaintiff in this action. This memo, written 6 months after Blower's death, talks of insurance for a proposed contract at Columbia University for similar drug tests, and says these experiments occasionally may result in unavoidable fatality.
And what did it mean to you when you were first apprised of how your father actually did die?
It was worse than losing him in a very strange way.
A suit filed by Elizabeth Barrett against the Army Chemical Corps is now pending in federal court. Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain. The Associated Press reported in 1975 that the chief researcher on the program, Dr. Russell Monroe, said the experiments involved only monkeys and cats, that some researchers had branched out into research of their own on humans, that consent was always given by the patient, and that Tulane never gave the Army any kind of report. These are various progress reports written by Dr. Monroe for the Army and recently obtained by ABC News. We asked Dr. Monroe, now head of the psychiatry department at the University of Maryland, about his remarks to the AP.
I think it's a little bit of a distortion. What I meant by, or what I reported at that time was that we published the data. We would not give the Army the data and let them declare it secret.
From one of the progress reports of Dr. Monroe, a report of a woman who had electrodes implanted in the brain and was then given LSD and other drugs. She became agitated, cried, lapsed into a trance-like state. Felt as if she were about to have a convulsion. Experienced waves of darkness and light. Had bizarre sensations in her neck and legs. Said somebody was trying to manipulate her body. At this point, Dr. Monroe wrote that the woman was obviously having paranoid ideas.
As a layperson, perhaps you can enlighten me. What therapeutic effect would the type of experiment that I just described have on a patient?
Well, the therapeutic effect would be indirect.
Was this patient aware that she was being given LSD?
Yes, I mean, they were told that they would be given some medications, and they should have...
Specifically LSD?
Well, we told them, I don't think that they would have even known what LSD was then at the time.
they were told that they would be given some medication which might make them feel worse.
Dr. Monroe, what do you think the Army Chemical Corps was looking for in all of this testing?
They were looking for an incapacitating agent, an agent that would not harm the person permanently, but would incapacitate them temporarily. That seemed like a humanistic way to to wage a war, if war is necessary.
When James Thornwell was given LSD by Army intelligence in 1961, this time it was no experiment. This time the express purpose was to peel back Thornwell's brain to bear any secret within it. This time the Army had gone operational. Thornwell was an Army private stationed in Orléans, France. Classified documents were reported missing from his unit. Thornwell became a prime suspect. His 2.5-month interrogation included administration of sodium pentothal, hypnosis, isolation, and deprivation of sleep. Army documents obtained by ABC News refer to this interrogation as conventional. Despite this severe questioning, Army intelligence was getting nowhere with Thornwell, and it was decided to slip him LSD. For 16 years, Thornwell never knew what had hit him.
It looked like I had craters off in my head, and I could see needles flying by, just big bursts of light just going by, and burst, every time they burst in color, the pain was so excruciating, felt like somebody was sticking me with a million pins, just everywhere. Oh, it just...
What's up, man?
I walked around.
What's up?
I lived through it.
No charges were ever brought by the Army against Thornwell. He was discharged for psychological disorders. But an Army psychiatric evaluation of Thornwell obtained by ABC News, one which was done prior to Thornwell being given LSD, says of him, fairly cooperative, oriented, alert, and gave no evidence of psychosis or depression. Thornwell still has serious problems. He's run through 2 marriages. He maintains he can't hold a job, can't concentrate, has nightmares, and feels socially and emotionally isolated. By far, the most chilling experiments we have uncovered took place at this Gothic estate known as Ravenscrag, halfway up Mount Royal in Montreal. It now houses the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry of McGill University. It was here that the CIA funded a series of experiments, severe experiments, the details of which have never been made public. A joint investigation by John Marks and ABC News finds that this was the closest experimentation to brainwashing that has yet been disclosed. The work was done by the Institute's then director, Dr. Ewan Cameron. Val Orlico of Winnipeg, Canada, the wife of a member of the Canadian Parliament, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. She entered the Allen Memorial Institute because of severe depression.
To look in the nurse's window to see what was written down on various things on the desk. And I saw my name on a form, and there was a prescription there, and it was for lysergic acid diethylamide 25. And I thought, what in hell is that? So Dr. Cameron came in the morning and administered the drug, and we were off. And then the drug began to take hold very rapidly because it was an IV injection. And things became very furry and very frightening, and had a lot of sensations that it's very difficult to recall. And it seemed to me that it went on for hours and hours and hours. I had several sensations. I was a squirrel in a cage. I was Alice who'd taken the wrong pill and suddenly grown very small, and I couldn't get off the bed. And what was I going to do? How was I going to get a pill that would make me larger again? And at least once, and sometimes 3 times a week, I had these injections. for a period of approximately 2 months. And they were very, very frightening. They were very disagreeable. I thought it was all some sort of very different type of treatment, but certainly a helpful treatment for me. I didn't know anything else about it. Nobody explained it to me. Nobody ever asked me if I was willing to do it or anything.
He had this feeling that he would be able to get through the resistance of illness and to reach deep changes very quickly.
Did he?
I don't think that when you look at that in retrospect, the hopes that he had been in any way fulfilled.
But Cameron would plunge on. The next step was what he called psychic driving. This involved almost endless tape-recorded messages and more drugs for the patient. Cameron wrote that this was the way to make direct controlled changes in personality.
I thought this was the coldest and most impersonal treatment that anybody could give to anybody in the world. And I became more and more despondent and more angry. I mean, my strongest emotions were hostility and apathy. And I finally began to think, I don't care about anything, nothing matters. I just became so despondent that I thought I can't live like this any longer.
The most severe technique Cameron used was de-patterning. He described it as breaking up the existing patterns of behavior by means of intensive electroshock therapy with prolonged periods of sleep. He carried out these experiments in something he called the sleep rooms.
People in there were like babies. They cried and they were very disoriented. And we were very afraid of the sleep room. We used to walk very carefully against the side of the corridor that was opposite the sleep room with our backs to the wall when we'd go by.
Cameron used this combined sleep electroshock treatment on patients as long as 30 days. One patient he kept asleep for 65 days. Cameron retired, and his successor, Dr. Robert Cleghorn, ordered a follow-up study on the patients treated with Cameron's de-patterning method.
It showed that it was no more beneficial in its result than the use of more conservative methods.
But the follow-up study showed that 60% of those who had been de-patterned still had amnesia for periods of anywhere from 6 months to 10 years. That's quite a memory loss, isn't it?
That is a memory loss. Indeed it is. It's I think, more than desirable.
In retrospect, does Dr. Cameron's experimentation and his treatment appear harsh?
I would say yes. This forceful type of approach as I was describing to you, it is definitely, it can be said that it's harsh.
I wouldn't call it harsh. I would say it was harder on the staff than it was on the patients, because these people had to be fed and they had to be cared for and they had to be given sufficient fluid and food and toileted and so on and so forth. It was a very difficult thing for the staff to follow these patients properly and see that they did well.
Well, I'm glad he was concerned for the staff, but I think it was harder on the patients. When I found out about the experimental research that it really was, I was really quite outraged. I mean, I couldn't believe it. How could anybody? I mean, I was just outraged. I was angry and I was outraged, and I thought, all these people who've been hurt and nobody was ever helped by any of this damn stuff and all the misery that I at least went through. And it was as though it was like a missing link. This is why I never got better. But damn it all, I wouldn't. I could have maybe had a different kind of life. And that makes me angry and sad, and I don't know how to explain how I feel, really. I just
How did you feel when you learned that Dr. Cameron's experimentation was financed by the CIA?
Well, I thought, I can't even use the word that I thought, because I thought, that bastard. And I think it's inhuman. I don't know what kind of people could cause this to be. I really don't. I feel very strongly about it. I realize the CIA is a very important organization and they have a very important job to do. But God, it surely doesn't have to be done on people who are totally incapable of knowing what's happening or having any defense against it. And I can't imagine the mentality of people who would do this. I just can't.
As for Dr. Cameron, he died in 1966 while mountain climbing. A colleague wrote of Cameron, "For him the ends justified the means. And when one is dealing with a waste of human potential, it is easy to adopt this stance." Dr. Cameron seemed ideally suited for what the CIA had in mind.
Normally conditioned American who's been trained to kill and then to have no memory of having killed. His brain has not only been washed, as they say, it has been dry clean.
The Manchurian Candidate, a programmed robot American assassin created by the communists. Was it possible? It was the Cold War, and especially the trial of Joseph Cardinal Mindszenty, who was forced to testify in a Hungarian court that he was a spy. And then later, the Korean War, with the coerced and mainly fraudulent confessions of American servicemen.
My germination took place on the...
That would spark intense interest in intelligence circles about brainwashing. John Gittinger, former chief psychologist for the CIA.
There was widespread anxiety in the armed forces and in higher government level that somebody was really developing some kinds of techniques that were being used to get people to perform in certain ways. And therefore, there began to be quite a concerted effort to try to see if we couldn't get a better handle on just what the process of brainwashing was.
The CIA secretly commissioned a study of Chinese and Russian methods at the Cornell University Medical Center. The leader of that study was Dr. Lawrence Hinkle, who had been observing Soviet methods back to the Stalin purges and the Russian show trials. What were the Soviet methods of breaking an individual?
You're detained. You're detained, however, in fact, totally detained, absolutely isolated from everyone else, with one man whose job it is to get you to write the extent to which you are a criminal. In this setting, you can get people to do most anything, you see, because you don't have to lay a hand on them. You can use anxiety, you can use isolation, you can keep them awake, and by the time you get through and you go up before the judge, the fellow says, "Were you a spy?" He says, "Yes, I was a spy."
Well, the purpose of the Cornell study was to find out about communist brainwashing techniques. CIA documents indicate that the agency was interested in developing mind control methods of its own. Another CIA-sponsored study at Cornell was designed to test ways to control nationalist Chinese living in this country. What were you looking for? What did you find?
All right, well, I'll tell you about that. Our friends in the Central Intelligence Agency were interested in having some Chinese nationals tested with these tests, while at the same time examined by a group of psychiatrists and sociologists and psychologists.
Well, the agency's perception of the work you were doing, in CIA documents we have examined, it says that the project that was being done here, they intended to use everything learned about the new agents to induce them to, quote, to perform acts of a complex, purposeful nature.
Yeah, but that was never done.
The effects of which may be out of keeping with the individual's
previous sort of thing was never done. Those people were not, that was, when they first came here, the first people they sent up to see us, you see, were operational type people from the CIA with some rather wild ideas.
Documents clearly show that the CIA was attempting to develop agents over whom they had as much control as possible. Agents who would perform tasks contrary to their own good.
Who were lost on the patrol. Can you recall what happened to them?
Yes, sir. It was a very clear action for a night action.
Is a Manchurian Candidate, controlled by others to do things against his will, possible?
It was a remarkable film because as far as I'm concerned, it made something totally impossible seem absolutely credible.
That sort of thing always struck me as more science fiction than fact.
I would say the answer is yes, but there are many qualifications to that.
Dr. Milton Klein, a psychologist, a clinical and experimental hypnotist, and unpaid consultant to the CIA.
The qualifications would be the subject selected to produce the kind of behavior that you wish, the amount of time, the procedures that are utilized, and the motivations of the people who are designing, executing, and administering the procedures. You're asking whether an individual can be, under hypnosis, influenced, coerced, persuaded, shaped to perform an antisocial act, or a destructive act, or an act of violence. My answer would be yes.
Captain Marco, will you be good enough to lend Raymond your pistol, please? Yes, ma'am.
Thanks, Ben. Sure, kid. Case reported by Dr. Paul Reiter, who was the chief psychiatrist at Copenhagen General Hospital, where a criminal hypnotist, being confined to a jail cell, found his cellmate to be a very susceptible subject. He trained this subject to eventually commit a robbery and a triple homicide, which was successfully carried off.
How valuable a tool can hypnosis be in the intelligence field?
None whatsoever. It has absolutely no use because nobody's ever been able to do that I know of, do it in an operationally feasible way. I'm not in any way saying that hypnosis doesn't take place. I'm not saying there's nothing to it.
I've confirmed from both CIA documents and interviews that from 1960 to 1963, James Angleton in the counterintelligence part of the CIA was very interested in hypnosis and indeed was carrying out operational experiments. The counterintelligence men thought it might be possible to make a breakthrough in the whole clandestine business, and they thought that hypnosis offered a great deal of promise.
I would say that most government agencies concerned with intelligence operations have been looking to hypnosis as a tool for a variety of purposes, one of which is to carry out and to execute certain intelligence operations on a basis where they would not have to rely completely on some of their own emotional reactions. Actually, they're entail murder. It could, if you consider that an act of killing someone under circumstances of war is murder. I think one has to define what that means.
Under circumstances of peace.
Under circumstances of peace, it would be murder.
Another former CIA agent says that potential targets of a possible Manchurian candidate were considered. One of the targets was Fidel Castro. The agent did not wish to be filmed or recorded. His remarks are read by someone else.
Castro was naturally our discussion point. Could you get somebody gung-ho enough that they would go in and get him?
But it was decided that a Manchurian candidate was not feasible. Is predictable absolute control of an individual possible?
I would say no. Predictable absolute control of an individual in any way, under any condition, is not absolutely so.
While the Manchurian candidate may not have been feasible, the search would continue for ways to predict and manipulate human behavior. And some would be successful. The work of this man, CIA Chief Psychologist John Ginninger, that would provide a significant breakthrough. He devised a personality assessment system that comes close to being able to predict how humans will behave. What exactly is the personality assessment system you devised?
It's really a descriptive system, an attempt to try to describe personality in a relatively systematic way so that hopefully you can get some kind of an idea to predict what the behavior between different kinds of individuals. Obviously, in intelligence work, like anything else, there is a considerable amount of sizing up. So we experimented with all kinds of ideas about what one should look for to try to see whether or not this could give us clues of the motivations of somebody else, the attitudes of somebody else, the veracity of somebody else.
Gittinger's system had many uses in intelligence work. One was to draw personality portraits of world leaders. Using Gittinger's system, the agency concluded the Shah of Iran is a brilliant but dangerous megalomaniac whose basic problems resulted from an overbearing father. And there were other applications. Your assessment staff played a key role in helping other governments pick their police intelligence agencies, including, we've learned, the Korean CIA, Uruguayan National Police. Can you tell us about this?
No.
Author John Marks,
the former number 2 CIA man in Uruguay, told me how in 1966 John Gittinger and an assistant traveled down to Uruguay and gave the tests in order to select members of the Uruguayan intelligence service. A psychologist who used to work for the CIA told me in 1961 he personally traveled to South Korea as part of an American CIA effort to set up the Korean CIA and to give the personality test to candidates for the Korean CIA to choose the best man for their secret police.
But one of the basic functions of Gittinger's system was finding the vulnerabilities of an agent, a double agent, or a potential agent. In its applicability to intelligence work, isn't the PAS system looking for a person's soft spot?
Well, of course, the answer to that is yes, but I hasten to say soft spot. This is what I consider a negative word.
Of the hundreds of behavioral projects undertaken by the CIA, Gittinger's appears to have been one of the more successful and more conventional. Other experiments were not as conventional. Neurophysicist Dr. Jose Delgado was financed by the Office of Naval Research. In this experiment, the bull is sedated. Electrodes are implanted in its brain. Delgado transmits an electronic impulse to the center of the bull's brain. Delgado has remote control of the animal. Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man. Other areas were examined through the 60s and 70s. Brain surgery, psychosurgery, creation of amnesia, parapsychology, manipulation of genes. Even though past and present CIA officials have indicated this kind of work ended in 1963. We may be learning more about this shortly.
I wrote to the CIA. I made another Freedom of Information request asking for material on these questions for the research that took place during the 60s. Finally, after a long delay, the CIA told me that they had 130 boxes of material. That's a whole room full of material, which was a documentary record of CIA behavioral research during the 1960s.
And one of those who took part in these programs.
Thank you, sir.
In 1977, the Senate subcommittee heard testimony from many of them, but the testimony was not that revealing. According to one of them, they agreed amongst themselves to keep the inquiry within bounds that would satisfy the committee. Former narcotics officer Charles Siragusa says that he was asked to limit his testimony by the man he reported to at the CIA.
He was quite upset about it. He hasn't spoken to me since. I did see him at the congressional hearing, but he didn't talk to me.
He did want you not to say anything.
He wanted me not to say anything.
To perjure yourself.
That's right. Well, either that, I'd have to perjure myself or take the Fifth Amendment. And I'm not about to take the Fifth Amendment for anybody.
Okay. Former CIA chemist Robert Lashbrook testified he had no first-hand knowledge of the agency-run safe houses when in fact he supervised one of them.
There was very little.
And according to George White's diaries, was at a safe house when White conducted what he called an LSD surprise experiment. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, whom we recently filmed near his California home, oversaw many of the CIA behavioral programs. He retired in 1973 and destroyed the records of this work. In sort of a valedictory letter, Dr. Gottlieb wrote that he and his colleagues had been able to maintain contact with the leading edge of developments in the field of biological and chemical control of human behavior. Dr. Gottlieb also testified before the Senate subcommittee, but from an anteroom where he could not be filmed because of what his lawyer termed health and cardiac problems. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview. And what of George White, the man who helped the agency in so many of its programs? He would retire here to Stinson Beach, California. And shortly before his death, he wrote to his boss at the CIA, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, and summed up his career by saying, "It was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, and cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" Has mind control been achieved? From all of the available evidence, it appears doubtful. The human will has prevailed to this point. But work is continuing in this field. How deeply are the Russians and other dictatorships into this? We really can't say, and the CIA is reluctant to give out any information about it. But the basic question is, what place does all of this have within a democracy? One final point should be made. As one of the persons who worked on these programs told us, we are conscientious, capable, and very dedicated scientists working for our country. Their work speaks for itself. This is Paul Altmaier for ABC News. Been a presentation of ABC News.